with just a little introduction about African American History Program at the Louisa County Historical Society, presented by Marilyn Campbell, who is our grant program manager. So take it away, Marilyn.
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you for attending our 4th weekend speaker highlight series in commemorating Black history in the month of February in homage to Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Week, now month. I'm Marilyn Campbell, the grant program manager with the Louisa County Historical Society's African American History Program. And it is just one of several community-oriented programs as well as events that the society hosts. The Historical Society was created in 1966, and its mission is to preserve, foster, and bring to light the history of the Louisa County community. The African American History Program was created because, as stewards of the history, the society realized that they needed to better reflect the African American community in its archival collections. So in November of 2020, a community advisory council was formed in partnership to guide a pilot program with 3 main projects to commence in the year 2021. The first project, the Freedom of Choice Remembrance Project, reflecting the oral histories of the 13 students to first integrate Louisa County High School in 1965. A historical marker dedication ceremony was held February the 12th of this year to commemorate those names. If you go by the school grounds, it has all the 13's names listed. Project coordinator for the project was Vernon Fleming. He also was a student, an 8th grade student at that time. The second project that we're to enact and keep going, what we did in 2021, was the community-wide oral history campaign to capture the voices in community, especially of the elderly. And we welcome you to send in nominations or participate as one to be interviewed. If you were born, you live in, or lived, or worked, or played in this community by visiting people here, you have voice in the community. So use your voice your history. The third project is a research of the best practices for developing a curriculum of local African American history for the local schools. And we are happy to have on board an intern from Louisa County High School. Her name is a student. Her name is Gabriella Whitfield. So we celebrate today by our commitment to listening to voices in community and bringing voices to the community to share valuable resources. Our guest speaker today is to do just that. She will be presented by Caitlin Coughlin, our executive director. At the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer period. So you can put your questions in the chat and we will leave you our contact information. I also want to say and take this time to thank those private donors, as well as the community, the Charlottesville Area Community Foundation, for Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, and the Rappahannock Electric Cooperative for their support. So Caitlin, go right ahead.
Yep. And so just kind of going from what Marilyn said, I've shared in the handouts tab, which is above your chat on your screen, a link which you can download, and it's a flyer for our oral history project. Gives you some more information about contacting us and kind of the program in general. Feel free to download that.
I do want to say one other thing before we go forward. on the Oral History Project. Latika Lee is the Oral History Coordinator, and that is a community-wide program. I think I missed that piece, but it's a community-wide effort for capturing that information from the elderly. So we just want to make sure you know we have people on ground. And we also have one other person that we may sometimes overlook, and he's our volunteer program coordinator, Ethan Starr. He recently joined forces, and he is one that if you want to volunteer and link up with a program in particular, he can help you there. So, Caitlin, I think we've covered most of that. And
we've got it all.
Yes. Thank you.
So I just want to say that our speaker today is Janice Ross Lorenz. She's from Washington, D.C., and is the only child of the late Marjorie Quarles Ross and Thomas Chapman Ross, both of Washington, D.C. Janice has a long family history and has lots of individuals who are going to be presented here, but both of her parents have paternal and maternal grandfathers who served in the U.S. colored troops in the Civil War, and she can trace her roots from Louisa and Culpeper and Vicksburg and Lynchburg in Virginia to Port Tobacco, Charles County, Maryland, all the way to Kentucky and Missouri and Omaha, Nebraska, and Mound City, Kansas. So this is a great example of how all of these different people ended up on all different places and we're all interconnected and trying to figure out that story. Janice is a graduate of Earlham College, and she received her master's in city planning from Howard University. She spent the bulk of her career doing transportation planning and looking at issues of division and economic upheaval, particularly surrounding issues that arose from the struggle for equality in urban areas in the 1960s. So Janice spent a lot of her career in the nation's capital and the greater DC area working as a planner for the Office of Civil Rights at the Urban Mass Transit Administration, which is now the Federal Transit Administration, developing quantitative models that ensured federal funds would be equitably utilized for awarding federal mass transit grants. So Janice has a long line of commitment to public service, and she retired from the Federal Transit Administration. Now she lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, John. They are members of the Historical Society. She has two children, one who's an infectious disease physician, and the other is a licensed social worker. And she enjoys traveling and doing genealogical research about her family and just in general. So we're very fortunate to have Janice here to tell us about her experience doing genealogy and give us a little glimpse into her life through the lens of her family. So we'll let you take it away, Janice.
Thank you, Caitlin, for that kind introduction. And good morning to you and to all of you who are taking this hour from your Saturday morning to listen to my story. I have a confession to make. Unfortunately, when I was growing up, I didn't listen to my parents or family members. I didn't pay attention when they spoke about the past. I saw old-fashioned things in our home, but didn't know where they came from or understand why they were important. I didn't know about important papers and letters and pictures that told interesting stories. People came to visit that I didn't know. My cousin Joe and cousin Marie came from New York, but I didn't know how they were connected. I still, to this day, still don't know how they were connected. I sat on the sidelines during these conversations and didn't ask questions. When I was small, my parents traveled to places where my ancestors lived. Again, I didn't understand. I was very young, and I really didn't understand why these places were important or even interesting. So much of this information about the past I just didn't absorb. However, I am grateful to my mother and father for trying to explain our history. Perhaps they knew how these things were a part of me and who I could become. Some pieces of information stayed with me. And God bless her, it was a lady in her 80s who came to live with us from Kansas at the end of her life. She brought a treasure trove of family history about my father's people that allowed me to begin to discover the rich African American history of my paternal family's past. This provided me with plenty of curiosity to learn about my Louisa County, Virginia, and Southern Maryland family on my mother's side. This is partly their story and how I was able to discover and make sense of it all. Next slide. That elderly lady was my great aunt, Eliza Ross Clarke. Eliza came to DC to live with my father, my mother, and me on a train from Kansas in 1952. She brought all of her possessions in a trunk. And some of these things she brought were reminiscences of her mother's slave history, her mother's and father's obituaries, her father's Civil War USCT discharge paper, pictures of her brothers, newspaper articles, and family articles about their life in Kansas. My parents kept most of these possessions after Eliza's passing in Washington in 1954. Next slide. So, where did the paternal and maternal families come from, and how did they come together? So the Rosses, my paternal side, were well documented thanks to Aunt Eliza and her mother's early literacy during the Civil War era. However, the Quarles and Kellys on my maternal side were a different story. It was difficult to trace because of scant documentation. Oral tradition was the starting point for my quest. In the Quarles family, the oral tradition begins with this lady, Margaret Minor Quarles Hill. She was born in Louisa County, Virginia, to Overton and Louisa Watson Minor. She married Armistead Quarles in 1869 and raised 4 children. The family lived in Culpeper before migrating to Philadelphia. Margaret passed down oral family history to my mother, Marjorie Quarles, her granddaughter, during their times together in Philadelphia. Stories linked her to Culpeper, but not to Louisa County. Following this oral lead from my mother, my cousin Helen Quarles from Washington, D.C., and I paid a visit to the Culpeper Library local history room. The librarian there provided us with a birth record document which showed a child named Gracie Quarles. You see that highlighted on the slide there, the first name. Born to Father Armistead Quarles in 1876. Discovery of Gracie corresponded with my great aunt Grace, who was my mother's caregiver in Philadelphia until my mother went to Cheney College. During the course of our visit, the librarian suggested that we also visit Louisa County, specifically the Louisa County Historical Society, and participate in the genealogical workshop there. We did this, or at least I did, a little later on, and made the acquaintance of a former board member, Gloria Gilmore. In the course of our discussion, I spoke of our family's history, mentioning the names of Quarles and Minor. These rang a bell with Gloria. Next slide. Lo and behold, I received an email from Maryland, by way of Maryland, from Gloria Gilmore, that provided the missing link in the family story. Based on a conversation that I had had with Gloria at the society, some months later, Gloria sent this list of enslaved people from landowner Richard O. Morris of Green Springs District, Louisa County, Virginia. Highlighted, it's not very clear here, but highlighted, the first names include Armistead, Margaret, Overton, and Louisa, all first names linked to my Quarles and Minor ancestors. Presence of these people belonging to the same owner in Louisa County suggests that Armistead knew the Minor family, including his future wife. So the question arises, could this be where the Minor and Quarles family came together, at the Hawkwood Plantation? On another visit to Louisa County Historical Society, it was suggested we take a look at the book Old Home Places of Louisa County. You can see this, which can be purchased at the society. Turned out to be a very for $49. Yeah. Well worth the money, I must say. We did this and found information about the very wealthy landowner Richard O. Morris, the name on the previous slide. I wonder if you could go back, Caitlin, to that slide. Gloria Gilmore was kind enough to make note that these were the enslaved people from that plantation. There were 4 pages, and my ancestors, we believe, appear. Okay, moving forward, please. We learned that Richard Overton Morris built Hawkwood in the Green Springs District, Louisa County, from 1851 to 1854. His 1862 tax records included taxes paid, believe this or not, 92 enslaved people, 4 of whom appear to be the Quarles and Minor family. This led me to believe that my family came from this plantation. And there in the center column is a picture of Hawkwood. I think we can probably see that pretty well. This search turned up Armistead and Margaret's also later a marriage record of Armistead and Margaret in 1869. And much later, as a result of our search at the Louisa County Courthouse, we recently found a voting registration. Actually, we just found this last week, a voting registration list of colored people from 1867, on which my great-great-grandfather Arthur Quarles and his son, my great-grandfather Armistead, are listed. So they voted in 1867, we believe. Okay. After 1870, the couple moved out of Louisa County. They migrated north to Culpeper. Armistead, Margaret, and 3 children listed in 1880 census, which I was able to find on the Ancestry.com website, living in Cedar Mountain, Culpeper County. Although names of 2 children were different from the ones in the birth records, with occupation of Armistead as being a farmer. A 4th child, Arthur, Janice's, my grandfather, was born in 1888 in Philadelphia. So that leads us to believe they migrated from Louisa, Cedar Mountain, and then into Philadelphia. Armistead died. Unfortunately, we don't know his death date. But Margaret remained in Philadelphia, remarried, and was known as Margaret Hill. Their son, Arthur Quarles, my grandfather, married Minnie Kelly in 1907 and lived in Washington, D.C. So they came back south to the District of Columbia. My grandfather Arthur served in the Navy during World War I and was buried at sea in 1918 after contracting the Spanish flu. So now we move to the Kellys, my mother's maternal grandparents from Charles County. This gets a little tricky and confusing, so please bear with me. My mother's oral history included a memory of her grandfather, James Kelly. He was a Civil War veteran and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery with his wife, Grace Adams Kelly. When James joined the Union Army, the 32nd USCT Regiment, in 1864, he changed his name to William Turner. Now, this is the tricky part. Please bear with me. We don't know why he changed his name, but we do know, however, that he was a substitute soldier. In the 1990s, I visited the National Archives to research the William Turner U.S. Army file. In this file, I found a very detailed 6-page document, a deposition taken after William's death, made by his wife, Grace Turner Kelly. The purpose of this was to have proved that she was in fact married to James Kelly, also known as William Turner. In this document, which was full of wonderful information about the two of them and their families, it explained their family slave history in Port Tobacco, Maryland, their courtship while they lived on adjoining plantations as enslaved people, and their marriage, and some of his Civil War service history. The purpose was to prove that she had been married to James Kelly, as I said, who became William Turner, and therefore qualified her for an Army widow's pension. Witnesses to the deposition included Grace's daughter, my grandmother, by the way, Minnie Kelly, who had not yet married her husband, James Kelly, Arthur Quarles, rather, and her nephew, Francis Kelly. Unfortunately, or fortunately, ultimately, after some further research by the Veterans Pension Bureau, her identity was confirmed and she received a pension. Fortunately, before my mother passed, we visited the Arlington Cemetery to view William or James Kelly and Grace's graves in the Black section of the cemetery. I had previously asked the Veterans Administration to change William and Grace's names back to their given names, James and Grace Kelly. This was done in time for our visit. Next slide, please. Following Gloria Gilmore's suggestion, I did a partial family tree to illustrate the connection between the Louisa County, Virginia, and Charles County families. It's by no means exhausted, and I've done further trees that have shown the entire family. I show here some important names who have figured in this presentation. As you can see, unfortunately, I don't have dates for my great-great-grandparents, but we believe that they were born around the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century. Arthur Quarles, Hissy Adams. Of course, there's Armistead and Margaret, my great-grandparents. And then there's the Kellys. My Grace Quarles Minor, who was the role model for my mother in Philadelphia, with whom my mother lived until she went off to college. And then, of course, my grandparents, Arthur and Minnie Kelly, the two connected at that time in 1907. And my parents, Marjorie Quarles Ross, and my father, Thomas Chapman Ross. And I am the product of that union. Going back a bit, and I'm so happy that I've had these documents to share with you. Let's look at a portion of some of the original documents Eliza bought that helped tell the Ross family, remember my paternal family, Ross family story. I have in my possession Whitfield's discharge, the original discharge document from his USCT service in 1865. I have lengthy, although you see the excerpts here, lengthy obituaries that tell the story of Whitfield and Margaret Ross's lives. This was one for Whitfield when he passed away on March 11, 1926. And also a very long reminiscences of memories that was done for Margaret, my great-grandmother Margaret, on her 90th birthday in 1942. These are the original Ross ancestors that I know about. On the left, our tintype documents or tintypes that Eliza brought. And then later, my parents had those tintypes embellished on the right into these portraits, which I have now hanging in our living room. So a little bit, and I think it's a remarkable story about my paternal grandparents, great-grandparents. James Whitfield was born into slavery, we believe, although the family law was it was Vicksburg, but we can't find Vicksburg, but we do think it was Lynchburg, Virginia, around 1826. Remarkably, he was bought and sold 7 times and had 7 different masters. He ran away from Missouri into Kansas and joined up with the 1st Kansas Volunteers, which later became the 79th USCT, and fought heroic battles in 1863 to 1865. He settled in Kansas and married Margaret Chapman. Margaret, also born into slavery in Kentucky, was sold away from her father and with her mother and her siblings was taken to Missouri. However, fortunately for them, they were freed by Union soldiers who were moving west and taken to Mound City, Kansas. There was a site of an underground railroad depot. Remarkably, her mother paid 5 cents a day for 18 months for her to learn to read and write by some rather notable Quakers. They also grew food for the Union Army. Margaret and Whitfield raised and educated 5 children who went on to HBCUs and other institutions of higher learning. These children had successful careers in farming, education, pharmacy, home economics, and church leadership. Next slide, please. So, these are the 3 eldest sons. James, who became a school principal in Kansas City. Walter, who became a pioneer. He became a homesteader, a prairie school teacher after finishing college, and lived in Russell Springs, Kansas. And Frank, who died rather young, was a high school honor student with plans to attend college. He died at the age of 22. Next slide, please. So here's my grandfather, the youngest of the group, Thomas C. Ross. Unfortunately, this is the best picture I have of him. This is a picture of him in his pharmacy in Omaha, Nebraska. He was a graduate of the University of Kansas Pharmacy School. Unfortunately, he passed away several months before I was born. So, how did I get all of this information? The list is rather lengthy, but I can share that my initial visit to the National Archives was very enlightening when I found that deposition. That was the piece of information that gave me the genealogical bug that bit me. During that time, or shortly after, in the early 2000s, the African American Civil War Museum was being formed, along with a wall that included all of the Black Civil War veterans. And of course, my two great-grandfathers are on that wall. They have a museum with staff that helps to people do research. I can't encourage you enough to check out Ancestry.com. It's worth the money. And also perhaps do your DNA. When I did that, my DNA, a second cousin appeared who lives about 15 minutes from me. And as it turns out, her great-grandfather and my great-grandfather were brothers in Port Tobacco, Maryland. That was a great find for both of us. All right, now, Louisa County Historical Society. What can I say about you? Thanks so much for your wonderful support in all the information that we've so far and have been led to about our family, our Louisa County family. The Culpeper County Library was also a starting point in which we found information and learned that the Culpeper connection actually led us to Louisa County. I've taken several trips out to Kansas, to Lynn County, Mound City, and there is a historical society that's directed by Ola May, who has, by the way, an extensive file on the Ross family. Apparently, the Rosses were pretty important people in that community, and I'm very thankful to Ola May. Not too far from Mound City is Fort Scott National Park. That's the location where my great-grandfather Whitfield was inducted into service. The historians, the park rangers there, are very helpful, and I suspect in other places in national parks there are similar kinds of resources available to people. All right, Janice Ross, I hope you're out there. Thank you so much for your continued support and telling the story about the Kansas regiments who fought very heroic battles during the Civil War. And as many people probably may or may not know, the Civil War actually began in the West, in Kansas, and at the border of Kansas and Missouri. We talked to academics, and when I say we, my husband, John, and I, we talked to Virginia Tech, in Virginia, who were professors of Virginia Tech, Williams College, and Georgetown University. Because my great-grandparents, Kelly, believe it or not, married twice, once by Catholic priest and once by Anglican minister, Port Tobacco, St. Thomas Catholic Church was a site where we visited and were able to kind of take in what was available at the historic village. And finally, all the family photos and documents, which I haven't been able to share here, have been extremely helpful in tracing the stories. Next slide, please. So these are the suggestions I have for those of you who want to do genealogical resource. You really ought to listen to your elders at a very young age. And for you young people, please listen. Then when you're older, then play the elder role. Share information, give advice, talk to your young family members. As was shared last week, value and protect family treasures. Keep digging, networking. Thank you to the Louisiana County Historical Society, Marilyn Campbell, Gloria Gilmore, and certainly Caitlin. And have a husband. Thank you, John Schiller, a partner, a family member, a friend who's passionate about family genealogy. Thank you. And next slide. And I have to say thank you to my parents, my late parents, who taught me and gave me wonderful opportunities for education and travel and the importance of family. Thank you for being with me today.
Well, thank you so much, Janice, for that. We have some questions, so I'll start with that. But anyone, if you have other questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. We're also happy to pass along Janice's contact information later on in case anyone has further questions. But we'll start with just a question, but also some information. Someone had asked how you connected the enslaved people at Hawkwood with the Quarles and Minor families. And Elaine Taylor has chimed in here. Elaine Taylor is our former executive director at the Historical Society, and she's one of our main contacts for African-American research into genealogical lines in Louisa County. She's always willing to help out and assist. But she has a list of people proclaimed free from Hawkwood in 1865, and some of those have last names, as well as births of enslaved people born at Hawkwood. So these are all resources that we have, but I'll let you field that question for exactly how you did it. But know that these are options for other people who are interested that we have at the Historical Society or we have access to.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, Gloria Gilmore, who was a former board member, had done some research at the University of Virginia Alderman Library, and that's where that original list came from. And she sent that, and she even highlighted in her email those names, those family names: Armistead, Margaret, Overton, Louisa, which we had some clues. We knew about Margaret and Armistead. And then we also later found out about Overton, my great-grandparents, Overton and Louisa, through ancestry. So it was a process of elimination, and really those names continuing to pop up. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, and I think this is one thing I know that we encounter in a small community, you know, especially with African-American descendants, where we don't have a last name. These name patterns are very common, especially in the 19th century, regardless of where you are. I know in my family, it's this naming pattern that keeps coming up that is helpful, especially in these cases where you have an idea of place, like the Quarles, which is a very popular
name. That's correct. And Armistead, I mean, that name just keeps ringing true for all of the research, you know, that we've been able to do. And hasn't really appeared. It's not a real common name, actually, I guess, in that respect.
Okay, Janice, I have a question, and then I'm going to ask another one that's in the chat. But was Grace Quarles Monroe married a second time? The one that
yes,
you mentioned?
Yes,
okay,
she was.
1876.
Yes.
I'm interested in that Monroe because that's my mother's family.
Oh, wow. See?
So I need to know, who is that Monroe?
And unfortunately, you know, I've tried to find more information about this second husband, and you know, the search continues, and not been able. But I have to say that my mother talked about her Aunt Grace forever. This was the one person that made a difference. My mother grew up during the Depression. This was the one person that kept her disciplined, kept her on target for going to school. And, you know, my mother eventually was really the only sibling in her family that went to college. So she was the baby. So she lucked out, I think, in that respect.
Well, here's a question from Wendy. Do you have a suggestion or two on how to get children connected with genealogy?
Oh, gosh. I should ask my own children that. You know, and I can only reflect in my own life, you know, being married, raising children, trying to make enough money to send them off, you know, wherever to college. You know, you don't really pay attention, but I was an only child. So in that respect, I think listening to my mother probably was the best course. The oral history, you know, as much as we can share with them through oral history is probably the best way. And then travel. I think travel is an important way to expose them to historical sites, to historical lessons, history lessons. And after all, while this is an African-American story, this is also an American story. And let's not forget that, how our families became a part of the American story.
That's a great point. And I know from my experience speaking as a child who grew up being very interested in this, it's not a surprise that I ended up here. But I think that listening component is a really big key. I have very clear memories from an early age of listening to my grandfather talk about certain parts of his life, you know, growing up in Philadelphia and kind of what that's like.
I might add that I never knew any of my grandparents. They both had all were deceased, except for Aunt Eliza. And when she came, I was only 4 or 5 years old. But my mother and father, we always, during the summers, we went to Kansas. We visited other family members. So that made a big impression on learning about the Rosses. And then, of course, I had all of the documents that Aunt Eliza brought to Washington to share.
All right. Well, we have another question about James. Do you have more information, or have you looked into finding out more about his being a substitute soldier during the war?
Yes.
Besides the deposition.
Okay. A part of that deposition, when I did go to the National Archives, there was an Army file. And not only did it include that deposition, which, by the way, at that time was not digitized. I mean, I actually felt the hard copy. It was incredible. I mean, you know. But in that file was all of the investigative material that the Bureau had done about him, including his surgeon's report, including the fact that he had been a substitute soldier. And I had a document which said James Kelly was a substitute soldier for this Keefe. I believe the man's name was Keefe. So there was a formal document that actually showed that he was in fact a volunteer. Induction for part of his induction.
There's another question in the chat about, it's asking, Teresa's asking, do you know more about Eliza Ross Clarke's Clarke line?
Eliza Ross Clarke line. Okay. Well, Eliza Clarke was the eldest child, the only daughter of Whitfield and Margaret Ross. Okay. She married a Clarke. At some point, I believe he passed away. I'm, you know, this is my recollection. She came back to, she did go to California, but she came. All of this is oral history that I'm trying to recall. She came back to Kansas to live with her parents, and she ended up taking care of them into their 90s. Both this is remarkable. After their slave history, their farming, raising children, my great-grandparents, Whitfield and Margaret, lived to be in their early 90s. But at any rate, she stayed with them to care for them. I really don't know much more about her, unfortunately. I have her marriage record. There's a lot of census information where she appears with her mother and father. But other than that, really don't know much more, unfortunately. She didn't write. She wrote, and she could read and write, obviously, but she just really didn't document her life in any way.
Well, the question is how do we contact Janice Ross Lorenz? So,
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I suppose, Caitlin, I think that will appear. Please, be more than happy to help anyone. Thank you.
Could you say it out and I can type it in?
All right. Well, my email.
Oh, yeah, I'm typing it now, Marilyn.
Oh, okay, great.
You got it there? Okay. All right.
Yep.
All right.
That's Lawrence.janice@gmail.com.
All right. It's Lorenz, Lorenz, Lorenz.
I'm sorry. Mm-hmm.
Janice.
Janice at gmail.com.
Okay.
All right. Well,
Okay.
do we have any other questions?
Well, I did want to share too that Elaine commented back that Gloria and she worked together quite a bit. And just for your knowledge, in case you didn't know, but she made reference to a list that she was speaking of from UVA. But anyway, Gloria and Elaine have done quite a bit of work together when she was the executive director.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've put contact information. Well, Elaine put contact information for herself in the chat, but she is always willing to help out. And if you can't remember any of those things, just contact the Historical Society. You know, we have plenty of resources that we pay for that you have access to at the museum.
See the contact?
And then Elaine, we can put you in contact with her because she is a great resource and always willing to help out.
Now, we have contact information for online, and we'll leave that at the end. But also, you may want to just take a visit to the Louisa County Historical Society site, and that's at the Sargent Museum on at 214 Fredericksburg Avenue. We have our staff there as well as volunteers to assist, and by appointment you can tour on ground. There is also another house there, the Mitchie House, and it's a schoolhouse on the grounds. And one of the programs that is offered is the Hearth Cooking Guild. So one of the houses are used to cook in demonstration and when we have events on the grounds. So speaking of that, April is declared as Oral History Month, as well as April 23rd, the society will host a Heritage Festival. So it might be a great time to come by, if not sooner. So we have our information on screen. Are there any other questions in the chat?
I think we're good. We really appreciate everyone tuning in. And for those of you who may be here but missed other ones, we will be posting all of these videos on our YouTube channel and then putting comments or putting social media posts so that people can link and find them more easily. But you can tune in and catch it up on any ones that you missed or just interested in hearing them again. So we really thank you all for coming out, and stay tuned for our programs in April and continuing through the summer. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Janice, for
Thank
all
you.
of your
My
hard
pleasure.
work and being a great resource for all of our other members.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we hope everyone has a lovely day and enjoy the weather.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy your day. Thank you again.
Yep.